And here we go. We have liftoff. Propulsion continues to be nominal.
R68 chamber pressure looks good.
Following up.
Water towers fly! Yes!
Tango down to nominal.
Flight downside FD off. Bring in FD off. It's orange!
45! Oh my god! Oh my god!
Decollage.
What is it?
Put that in the big bag,
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
The methane would be igniting the flare, correct?
Yikes. You dead? Sure. We don't need any more of these.
All right, folks, you know the drill. Give me some 5x5s in chat. John Galloway here with NSF. Close to Intrepid this evening. Not exactly at Intrepid. It's been a tough day here in New York City. A lot of rain came through and actually caused a state of emergency to be called. The subways were mostly shut down, and the museum had to cancel astronomy night. Would have been tough to see some of the stars through the clouds, even if they had kept it going. But we were here in town. Our guest was here in town. And we figured we would keep the show rolling along here so everybody that was stuck at home and everybody watching across the map would still be able to see tonight's, we'll call it, virtual astronomy night event here with Intrepid Museum. Real quick, the folks across the street over here at Inc. 48 helped us out a huge amount. It's a hotel. The museum works with this hotel a lot. I know they put up the astronauts here sometimes because every now and then I hang out in the elevator with an astronaut that's going to be talking at the museum. But massive thanks to the folks at Inc. Totally a weird situation in Inc. 48. We do appreciate you getting us set up so we can still do the presentation. We're in a conference room. There's not much space shuttle behind us tonight. It's not just me, though. It is... Okay, audio's good. I'm making sure the audio's good all of a sudden because I had a quick wonder whether or not the audio was good. It's not just me. I've got a special guest here tonight who's going to be talking with us, Dr. Margaret Weitekamp. How are you doing?
Good, doing very well. Delighted to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being so flexible with us.
It is. We roll with these things at the museum. It's good to see that you do that in New York as well.
It really is. It's again, we were supposed to be at the museum. It was supposed to be astronomy night. You were going to do a fantastic presentation for us talking about a book that you had worked on, wrote.
Yes,
the verb?
Space Craze came out this past October, and it's based on my work at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum.
Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. That's a thing, isn't it? In fact, you curate things.
I am the chair of the Space History Department, and I'm a curator there as well, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a couple of minutes now.
So you have a lot of stuff in the collection that you can use to build on, and we're going to see some of that stuff tonight, huh?
Yes, so I'm really pleased that we can bring the slides to you as well, even in these circumstances.
In these circumstances. Folks, again, thank you so much for bearing with us here. A little bit of a different situation. Like I said, we're not at the museum. If you're just joining us, we're calling it Virtual Astronomy Night. We were here, we had the gear here. Most importantly, we had the special guest here. And we worked with the local hotel, Inc. 48, to continue bringing you the show so that wherever you were, whether you couldn't make it to the museum tonight in New York City, or you're stuck at home, not stuck at home, wherever you are in the world, if you're comfortably at home, wherever you are watching from across the rest of the world, like you can normally watch these virtual events, we're still moving forward with the show. So assuming everything is good to go here, let's hop right into it, shall we?
That sounds wonderful.
All right, so Space Craze. Tell us about Space Craze.
So this is a book that came out this past October. It is based on my work at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and I'm just really excited to get to bring it to you tonight. It is based on my work with artifacts, so I thought I would start with an artifact. And so what you're looking at right now is a 1936 trading card from Buck Rogers. The Buck Rogers in the 25th century was one of the very first adventure comic strips. Now, the very first one is Tarzan of the Apes, based on the Edgar Rice Burroughs novel and property. That came out in January of 1929. Buck Rogers in the 25th Century came out later in the month in January of 1929. So it's one of the very first adventure comic strips, but it's not actually where the character of Buck Rogers starts. The character of Buck Rogers starts as a character named Anthony Rogers in a short story by Philip Francis Nolan. And he wrote this story about a blonde hero, a former pilot from the First World War, who gets knocked out in a mine near Pittsburgh and wakes up. And unbeknownst to him, it is hundreds of years later, and the first thing he sees is almost exactly this image that we're looking at on this 1936 trading card. This is the female lead from Buck Rogers. This is Wilma Deering. You can see that she is leaping with the help of her technology, her anti-gravity belt. She is wearing tights. She's in kind of athletic clothing. And she is taking care of herself. What we learn within the very first strip, this would have been almost exactly the image that was in the second frame of the very first Buck Rogers strip ever, is that she is defending herself and America, which has been taken over by the Mongol hordes. So part of the kind of everyday racism that would have been uncommented upon in the comic strips at the time, in the fiction of the time. And this started as a short story that was published in a magazine, a book called Amazing Stories. And John Dilley, whose name you see in the upper left-hand corner of our trading card, was owner of a franchising company, a syndication company. And what they did was comic strips and advice columns and things like that. They sold things to newspapers. And he saw this story and thought this would make a wonderful adventure comic strip. Those seem to be very much coming into vogue. But it needs a little bit of a tweak. The character was named Anthony Rogers. Doesn't really sing. What if he could be Buck Rogers? Kind of play on the popularity of the Westerns at the time. And so Buck Rogers in the 25th century was born. It started as a daily comic strip. It became a Sunday comic strip, became a radio program, and by 1934, the Buck Rogers toys were becoming such a rage that there were department stores that for the holiday season, instead of having a Santa land, they had a Buck Rogers land. And so this becomes a tremendously popular, and it's one of the things that we have at the National Air and Space Museum. And so if you look at our next slide, you get a sense of this is where I'm usually coming from. This is the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum building on the National Mall. I hope that some of you have had a chance to visit it there. We're doing some construction, but we're ready to receive visitors again. So this is where I am one of the curators in the Space History Department. We also have a second site, which is our Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. And so that's out by Chantilly Airport. That's out in Chantilly, Virginia, by Dulles Airport. And it gives us a chance to have some much larger things. One of the things that used to be there was the Space Shuttle Enterprise, which is in the collection now at the Intrepid. So working at the museum, I work with a collection of objects. And if we could see the next slide, I want to show you some of what I am working with. So, thank you.
You could just be like, hey, pay attention. Show the next slide. There's the next slide.
Very good. So I work with what we call our Social and Cultural History of Spaceflight collection. And what this means is I work with our memorabilia of the actual spaceflight collection, and I work with our space science fiction objects. What kinds of things are those? So on the upper left-hand side, you see a small precious metal medallion that was set with stones. This was made in celebration of John Glenn's flight as the first American to orbit the Earth in February of 1962. They made one, and the jeweler presented it to Mrs. Annie Glenn and presented one to the Smithsonian Museum. So sometimes we're working with things that are almost one, if not in that case two, of a kind. Below that, you see a mission patch. This is from STS-93, which is the first shuttle mission on which Eileen Collins became the commander of the Space Shuttle mission, first woman commander. That's an everyday kind of item. You might own a mission patch. If you go to a space site to go see a launch, you might pick that up as a souvenir. So we have everyday things as well as rare things. We also have things, the next object there is a Revell model box. It's for not just for the plastic pieces on the little plastic trees, but also for the illustration on the front, which is that artist's conception, that artist's vision of what it would look like for John Glenn's flight to separate from its Atlas booster. Up in the upper right-hand corner, I've got a medallion that is a commemorative of Apollo 11. I kind of like this one because the artist bothered to make those three gentlemen actually look like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins. Sometimes you just get three heads. Sometimes they're really cheating, you just get three helmets. But this one actually looks like the three astronauts and is a nice collectible commemorative piece. So we have all of these different ways of remembering the spaceflight program, and then we also have the space science fiction objects. So we have this credit card done with the branding of Star Trek and a set of stickers from Star Wars. I like to think of the social and cultural collection as the ways that spaceflight has been imagined and the way that spaceflight has been remembered. And it's really in dealing with this collection that I started asking the kinds of questions that were going to lead me to the book that is Space Craze. So if we can move to the next slide, I would want to show people these objects, ray guns. So in the toys collection, I have a large collection that I inherited of ray guns. And I love this image because I think it really shows off the variety of colors and shapes, sizes, materials that make up these, and yet uniformly, easily, visually recognizable as ray guns. And you start thinking about the fact that lots of different space stories, in fact, maybe most space stories, have a ray gun, a phaser, a blaster as a part of it. And it really started to get me asking questions. I think a lot of times when people see a curator, that there's a curator in your television show or in your movie, that person knows all the facts. They can just rattle things off, and we know a lot of facts. But I really think that the special superpower of a curator is the question asking. Why is this so? How is it that we have quite so many ray guns, small handheld pistols, in a space toy collection? And really, it was in digging into that I started to get into some of my research. So if we can go to the next slide, I can show you the ways in which, right from the beginning, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon have those kind of hand pistols, a rocket pistol it would have been called at the time, as very much a part of it. So on the left here, we see the main actor is Buster Crabbe playing Buck Rogers in a series of movie serials. So if you went to a movie palace in the 1930s or the 1950s, you wouldn't have been going to a particular time to see a show. The show would always be playing. So there would have been a first feature, a second feature, a newsreel, a cartoon, and perhaps a movie serial, which is a longer movie chopped up episodically into pieces with a bit of a cliffhanger at each point. The idea that you go in 1 week and you see one part of the story, and then you're going to come back next week and catch up on the next part of this adventure. And so Buster Crabbe, a former Olympic swimmer turned actor, plays Buck Rogers in the movie serials in the 1930s. And so we have him here holding his rocket pistol. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have the big little book also showing Buck Rogers. And so I don't have to dig very far into the collections of imagery coming out of Buck Rogers and even Flash Gordon to get into these images that are really replete with a firearm. Why is that? And so that takes me to my next slide. So what we're going to do is a little 3-slide detour here into American studies and American history, because I think that's really where the answer to my question lies, which is one of the ideas about the American experiment was that the availability of land would solve many of the problems that had plagued humanity and particularly democracy in the old world. So Thomas Jefferson, as one of the founders, really had this idea that the available land in the New World was going to take care of problems like primogeniture and entail. So primogeniture, the idea that the law actually that the first son inherits all of the land, because if you start dividing it up in a few generations, there's not enough land to go around and be viable, and entail that all of that stays together and is handed down as one set, one package. So with something like the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, where Thomas Jefferson purchases this large swath of land outlined in red on this map, Jefferson thinks that he has purchased American liberty for 100 generations, that this is going to be what really is the fail-safe for democracy. And they had this very of its time idea of manifest destiny, that somehow the white settlers from the East were divinely destined to fill all of this empty space. But basically the idea is land in the West equals freedom. So on our next slide, you can see that his timeline is a little bit off. He thinks he has purchased liberty for 100 generations, and we know that by the 1890 census, which is only 87 years later, the census is saying there is no more unexplained, unexplored, unsettled land in the contiguous United States. Essentially, the frontier has closed. And so this gentleman, Frederick Jackson Turner, who's an American historian, gives this really important paper in 1896 at the American Historical Association. And he says this is a real issue for American national identity, because that frontier was absolutely crucial to the American national character. We were forged by this heartening experience of encountering the frontier, by bringing civilization to that, and by the frontier then strengthening American character. And this idea of winning the wilderness was absolutely critical for the development and sustainability of American democracy, for American character, making Americans explorers, inventors, adventurous, persistent. Now, again, a blind spot here. Completely ignoring the ways in which that space was not at all empty when it was being settled by white settlers. But this idea of the frontier thesis that Turner puts forward, almost immediately we start to call it the myth of the American frontier, because, next slide, pretty much as soon as you suggest this idea of the fundamental nature of the frontier, and the fact that it has disappeared, you start to see the frontier being mythologized. So you get a book like The Virginian by Owen Wister from 1902. It's not the first Western, but it's considered the first cowboy novel, and in many ways it sets some of the conventions that we see in the Western, and the West getting set as a site for social freedom, for rugged individualism, for common sense, and often where the wild meets civilization at the point of a gun. And it really sets some important archetypes that then get transported as we now finish our little 3-slide detour and we go back to these posters, which show you a little bit about the parallels between the ways that American space science fiction really very much operates on the model that was set with the genre of the American Western. Now, I'm not the first scholar to point out these commonalities, but they really struck me as I was digging into the artifacts that we have at the National Air and Space Museum. So you look at something like this 1929 poster for Gary Cooper's portrayal of the Virginian, that novel that we just saw from 1902, or the poster from 1939, from which we just saw the still of Buster Crabbe playing the hero, and we start to see some really striking similarities. So we've got our blonde, muscular hero, who is going to be the one who we follow through these adventures. He tends to have a youthful sidekick. He has an older, avuncular advisor who is either a scientist or a doctor. So think of your Mr. Spock kind of character, or your Doc Holliday in the Western. There is a woman who is a co-adventurer and the love interest of our blonde, muscular hero, but who has a distressing tendency to need rescuing when she's been captured. And then we put this core cast onto a spaceship that has a name and a personality, the same way that we knew Roy Rogers and his horse was named Trigger. We think of a spaceship named the Enterprise from Star Trek, or the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. That's almost a character in the story in its own right. And the right at the beginning of the story, that all comes together and they head off to a space-based place at the point of a gun for an adventure. And part of where this really crystallized for me was I was reading a piece done by a colleague who was looking at Korean science fiction, North and South Korean. And one of the things that he was noticing is that Korean culture is so rooted in tradition, in the land, in community, that Korean science fiction tends to be about future Koreans in a future Korea doing Korean things. But in staying with that connection to the community and to the land. And I thought the first thing that happens in most American space adventure stories is you head off, you board the ship, and you go someplace else. The first thing you're doing is heading off and exploring and adventuring. And so that really is what brought me back, if we go back to our artifacts on the next slide, to these ray guns. Because the one in the upper right-hand corner, that is the 1934 Buck Rogers gun that was developed by Daisy Manufacturing in Plymouth, Michigan. And so that was the one that really set off the craze in the holiday season in 1934. The one in the bottom is a smaller one, available at a lower price point the next year in 1935. That's the Wilma Deering gun, right? That's the girls' version of the toy. And then the one on the top left is a kind of prototype that was developed that we have in the collection at the National Air and Space Museum. So looking at these toys, I started really thinking about point of view, right? So I'm a curator, I'm also a mom, I've got a lot of toys in my house, and I'm a former kid, as we all are. And so I remember playing with these kinds of things and started thinking about who are you when you pick up this toy, when you play with this. And I was looking at Robin Bernstein as a historian at Harvard, and she's got this idea of scriptive things, that things in their form tell you how they are to be interacted with. They have a bit of a script for how we're going to approach them. Now, can you vary the script? Can you play against type? Of course you can. But you're unlikely to pick up this toy and pretend it's a baby doll. This is a toy that kind of tells you who you are when you play with it. And who you are when you pick this toy gun up is you start as Buck Rogers, or you could potentially be Wilma Deering. There's no Mongol horde toys. You're not expected to take on the viewpoint of the enemy. Might you in the neighborhood divide up in that way? But really the toy is kind of telling you that you are going to be the hero of this story, and you're going to be seeing it through those eyes. So as I was looking at these objects then, with our next slide, I wanted to really start to delve into all of the different kinds of toys. So I think usually this is a point in the talk where people are starting to wonder why there's quite so much talk about guns as a toy in a talk that's supposed to be about spaceflight. And so I had this slide in when I gave this talk a while ago, and I was going to take it out, and my daughter said, no, you have to have it in here. Because the guns are perhaps not the most inappropriate toy you could give to a child as we look at them with a kind of modern eye. This is the junior caster set. So this comes with two sides of a mold that you can see are held together with this big clamp. And it comes also with sticks of lead so that you could melt them in your kitchen and pour them into the mold and make your own lead figurines that you would then shave the edges off of and paint and get to play with. And so I don't know how you let your kids play with toys in your kitchen, if you would be very comfortable with people deciding that on Saturday afternoon perhaps we were going to melt some lead in the kitchen in one of your good pots and make your own toys. But these were very popular in the 1930s, I think in part because in a time in the midst of the Great Depression, you could not only make a toy, but you could make more than one. You could perhaps even, sell them to your friends or just share them around the neighborhood. So moving on from our junior caster set to our next slide, I wanted to bring in also Flash Gordon. So we've talked a bit about Buck Rogers, and I talk in Space Craze about the Buck Rogers archetype, this idea of the Western-style cast on a named ship going to a space-based place at the point of a gun, as a real archetype for how these stories get told in the United States. They're a kind of peculiarly American thing, but then they're very exported, and then also reflected back. And so I think that this is a real story where we're talking about Americanness not as something that's universal, but as something that's really culturally grounded, and it's useful to think about it in that way. But it's also immensely profitable. Buck Rogers was really making a lot of money in the 1930s, and so Flash Gordon is created as a character by a competing, the King Syndicate, that is selling to a different set of newspapers, and it is really very much the same cast of characters imitating Buck Rogers, although I always think, Flash Gordon is literally and figuratively flashier, right? You look at this bulbous gun with this kind of streamlined, modern lines, bright red, that shoots sparks out of the nozzle of it when you push on this, because it has a little flint on the inside. And you see that this is a much wilder kind of gun than you had with the Buck Rogers gun that we saw earlier. And with Flash Gordon, as we look at this character in the still on the next slide, we have the Buck Rogers archetype kind of even puffed up a little bit more. So this is Buster Crabbe, you recognize him now, who played both Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers in a series of serials in the 1930s. You'll see now that as Flash Gordon, with his lightning bolt across his chest, he's even blonder than he was in the first time. And he is holding on to the arm of Charles Middleton, the Caucasian actor who is playing Ming the Merciless. So it's not just nameless Mongol hordes now, but a named, mustachioed Asian supervillain. And I think there are really important ways that this sets up a visual vocabulary for alienness, for a racialized other, for what the enemy is going to be in these adventure stories in the 1930s. And that is something, the role of the alien and the ways that that is used in terms of gender and in terms of race over time is really an important thing that I dig into in Space Craze. So as we go to our next slide, we can start to look at the ways that this Buck Rogers archetype gets translated into early television. So Space Patrol is a very early television program, live television. Started as a 15-minute program. It was local in the Los Angeles basin, and then it became a national program. It's essentially a space police procedural, but it starts with our core cast. And I think it's one of the places where it makes me feel better that I'm not forcing my analysis here, because in the middle you will see Buzz Corey, who is in the peaked hat with the lightning bolt on his chest as our hero. We've got Cadet Happy to his left, our youthful sidekick. On his right is his avuncular advisor, Robbie Robertson. In front of him is Carol, the blonde, is his love interest and co-adventurer, who gets captured. And then next to them, we have the single named character Tonga, who is an alien who has come over to being on the good side. And we can tell she's an alien because she's brunette. So sometimes it's very subtle pieces where so the whiteness of this, I have to say, is not particular to Space Patrol or to space science fiction. It's in fact endemic in early television in the 1950s. It was very much a part of how film making and also film watching was very racially segregated in the United States. So it's not atypical in that way, but I do think because space science fiction purports at least somewhat to give us some vision of what the future could be, this archetype that gets promulgated in the 1950s through television, through film, begins to shape the genre and set some expectations for the genre in ways that really then get played with and against for years to come. So one of the classic toys of this period would have been a play set. This is the Space Patrol play set. This comes from Michael O'Hara, who is a major donor who gave thousands of objects, a couple thousand objects to the National Air and Space Museum, and who really was the benefactor that in many ways created the core of the social and cultural history of spaceflight collection. And this was a piece that he really hesitated to give to the Smithsonian. He was very happy to hand over things that he had collected as a collector He started as a fan of Buster Crabbe, which became a fan of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and then space science fiction generally. But this was his toy when he was a boy. And this was something that he wasn't sure that he was ready to give to the museum. So I'm always have a special place in my heart for the generosity of our donors giving us something like this. But if we look at these kinds of space patrol or also other kinds of space play sets, we can really see the influence of the Western. So I'll show you the next one on the next slide. And this is the Superior Spaceport set. So toy makers took their Western sets, picture that fence around the outside having a log fence pattern lithographed on it instead of a futuristic city, and picture the building on the inside being a classic Western fort. And then the little plastic pieces that would come with this, the little figures, would have been, at the time, cowboys and Indians. Right? So my colleagues at the National Museum of the American Indian have talked and written very persuasively about how damaging it is to grow up in a nation that turns you into the little plastic enemy and sells it as a set. That kind of bifurcation, that us versus them, enemies, in this case aliens versus astronauts, was very much a part of these kinds of play sets. And so I think they really resonate in a Cold War moment where there's a real concern with subversion from within and attack from without, from the outside, to then have these kinds of sets where the play is really centered on that kind of attacking and defending of walls and of a fort. And so the layering of the space narrative onto the Western is particularly strong in this moment. And the other thing that I would say is that I really look at this, and as a mom, one of the things that struck me about this set is annoying, right? This is going to take a long time to set up before you can really play with it. And if it's in the middle of the living room floor, or if it's on your kitchen table, or you're trying to have dinner, this is going to be a pain in the neck. And this is a set that really becomes possible materially because of the kind of injection mold plastics that allow you to have the figures. But culturally, this becomes possible in a suburban household where you have a single family home and the child is likely to have their own room or to have a playroom. This is a toy that you only buy and let your kid have and set up if they have enough space to keep it out from it being underfoot. And so it really, I think, plays into that larger cultural context of the growth of the suburbs and also the racial divisions endemic in that, and the ways that then in that 1950s playroom, this becomes a toy that really, I think, carries a lot of important cultural messages. So we're going to do...
Chat says really quickly that the things that are the most annoying to clean up are the most fun to play with.
They are indeed the most fun to play with, and I've come out to the museum in order to work with some of these, and usually what I find is the object in its box sitting on a table. And when I came out to work with one of these play sets, what I came out and found was all of the pieces set up and all of the figures arranged, and the folks who were supporting me from our collections department had a fun time getting it set for the curator to come and inspect, not just sitting inert in its box, but fully engaged and out for play on the table. So you can't resist.
Can I ask one other question from chat?
Of course.
So when we were looking at the ray guns, you mentioned the sparks.
Yes.
Do they still shoot sparks? How do you verify they still shoot sparks? They were supposed to shoot sparks? It's a flint that would wear down.
It's a flint that would wear down. We do not shoot them.
Okay.
It is against our museum conservation practices to kind of actively to shoot the sparks. They're always advertised as harmless sparks. A lot of times there were little rockets that would run across the floor and have a flint that would then shoot sparks out the back, or that there are versions of the gun, an atomic pistol later in the Buck Roger lineage has them within a little window, so that you see them inside a little window on the Flash Gordon side where
safer that way.
It's a little flashier. It shoots right out the front.
Huh. It's right there with the lead casting set, right? The safe sparks. I am over off the camera, y'all. I'm just talking. But it's the lead casting set and the safe sparks coming out of the gun. And
yes.
No kidding. I'm reading chat over here. When I lean this way, I'm reading some chat comments. So chat, I am seeing, and I'll hop in a couple times if they say something funny or interesting.
That sounds good. Well,
How's that? I didn't mean to get you off your
not a
show
problem.
here.
So let's show them the last slide that I want to talk to you about the 1950s, which is about When Worlds Collide. Now, this is a George Powell movie from 1951. And we've talked a little bit about the racial segregation that you would have seen in television in the early years, as well as in films of the time. So this is a film of the time. And in order to talk about the movie, I'm going to have to kind of ruin the ending. But you've had since 1951 to catch up on this. So When Worlds Collide tells the story of a kind of space arc that is necessitated because an errant star is going to come bombing through Earth's solar system, and that star is dragging a planet. Now, the star is going to destroy Earth, but with a space arc, you might be able to rocket yourself from Earth to this trailing planet and set up kind of New Eden where you would repopulate the human race. So this is one of the final scenes from this movie, and in this we see the population that is on the American rocket that is going to repopulate all of humanity. And I think I don't have to call people's attention to the homogeneity of this boy-girl group of young, white, college-age young people, plus a boy and a dog, who are going to be repopulating the human race. And I think there are real ways in which, especially in the 1950s, space science fiction gets a reputation for melodrama. It gets a reputation for being very kiddie-focused, but it also has this reputation for being really lily-white, and the utopian visions of the future that are being put forward are really strikingly uniform and narrow. And it is in that way that when we go to our next slide, that Gene Roddenberry's vision of men and women of different races and a half alien going into space together on the bridge of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise really becomes a wildly new vision for space science fiction. Because those visions, like George Powell's When Worlds Collide, are what people had gotten so used to in the 1950s. So remember that in the 1960s, in the fall of 1966, when Star Trek comes to NBC, we're still in the midst of the civil rights movement. We're still in a moment where the women's movement, the second wave of the American women's movement, is just in its infancy. The National Organization for Women is founded in 1966, that same season, that same year that Star Trek first comes to the air. So that vision really becomes a very powerful one, and one that has lasting effects that I'm going to talk about through the 1970s and through the 1980s. But I wanted to introduce it here. So if we go to our next slide, I've talked a lot about the imagined visions of space science fiction, so I wanted to circle back because in Space Craze, I really tried to balance out how spaceflight has been imagined with how it's been executed, because the same social, cultural, political contexts that are shaping what's possible for how spaceflight is imagined are shaping what's possible for how spaceflight is executed. So many of you, I'm sure, on this feed recognize these gentlemen. These are the Mercury 7. These are the first astronauts selected by NASA, announced in April of 1959. A remarkable group of men, as you see here, of high-performance military-trained pilots who came to NASA really with a lot of skill as a part of a selection process that brought military pilots together and tested and came up with this elite group of 7 that would be the first ones to go into space for the United States. At the time, the uniformity and the homogeneity of this group would have been seen as a visual sign of their selectedness, of the exclusivity of who had been in this group. But even the gentlemen in this group recognized that they looked so much alike that in this image, and if we can throw it back up so that people can see it again, they're lined up in alphabetical order so that the newspapers will get their names right, because they look so much like each other that the captions would also often jumble them up. So from the left to the right, we have Carpenter, Cooper, Glenn, Grissom, Schirra, Al Shepard, and Deke Slayton. alphabetical order, left to right.
Makes it easy.
Makes it easy, gets the captions right in the newspapers, but really a reflection of the ways that at the time, that exclusivity, that selectedness, that sense of them having what Tom Wolfe called the right stuff is really then reflected in the uniformity of the appearance of all of these married, heterosexual, Christian, white men who come to this program with really these extraordinary skills. And I must reinforce what an amazing group of gentlemen this was, who were a product very much of their time. And that's what I'm interested in as an historian, is what is it about the time that produces this particular moment and says, these are the people who are going to be the ones to represent, to act as that hero in this Cold War conflict, which is the space race. So it takes a lot of change. It takes a lot of people pushing for change to change the faces of who's going into space. And that's really then what gets us, if we skip ahead a bit to the 1970s and to our next slide, to this group. These are a group of astronaut candidates selected by NASA in 1978. This is the group that is called the 35 New Guys. And this is the first class of astronaut candidates selected for the space shuttle program. And in that group, you have for the first time not only pilot astronauts, there had been scientist astronauts and pilot astronauts beforehand, but also mission specialists. So this was a new class of astronaut that was really going to draw on people with medical degrees, with PhDs, research degrees, who would be coming in and doing the research work that would be done in the middeck and in the payload bay of the brand new space shuttle orbiters. And that meant that you were drawing from a wider pool of possible candidates, a more diverse pool of possible candidates, and NASA knew that they wanted to make sure that the astronaut corps began to look more like the face of America. They couldn't have the kind of exclusive group that in the late 50s had looked very selected, now in the 1970s began to look exclusive, exclusionary, and they did not want that. And so here we have, starting from the upper left, I won't name all 35, but I will point out the 3 African-American men who were included in this. So Guy Bluford in the top left. In the middle of the second row, we have Fred Gregory, and below and to his right, Ron McNair, who was tragically lost aboard the Columbia in 1986. We also have the first Asian American astronaut, also on Columbia in 1986, so that's in the fourth row, second one in, Ellison Onizuka. And then the first 6 women to be a part of NASA's astronaut corps. So Anna Fisher, we have Shannon Lucid, Judy Resnick, Sally Ride, Ray Seddon, and in the bottom row, Kathy Sullivan. And this doesn't just happen. It happens because people have been bringing lawsuits, because people have been protesting to get women into the military academies. That first happens in 1976. To get women into law schools, to get women and people of color admitted into medical schools, to really make those changes. So that's a bottom-up thing that's happening, and then NASA is really responding to it. And if we can click forward to the other half of this slide, NASA, in fact, realizes, one more, that they have a bit of a legacy of past exclusion. People with these kinds of credentials don't necessarily think that NASA is going to be interested in them as astronaut candidates. And so this is a still from a promotional video that was made at the time. That's Nichelle Nichols. You remember her from the slide with the cast of the original Star Trek. She is the actor who played Lieutenant Uhura on that television show. And this is her with Alan Bean in a promotional video that NASA did, where they hired Nichelle Nichols to do a public relations campaign, visiting campuses, radio spots, television spots, advertising that NASA was really interested in more diverse astronaut candidates, and they in fact would be welcomed if they applied. So someone like Dr. Mae Jemison, who becomes the first African-American woman to become an astronaut, directly credits Nichelle Nichols with that decision to apply to NASA. So if we move to our next slide, this is one that would have been much better with the actual Space Shuttle Enterprise behind me, but I'll just have to have it on screen.
We tried.
The connections between the way space is imagined and the way space is executed are myriad, and in the 1970s you begin to see the power of fandoms and masses of people who are excited both about real spaceflight and about visions of spaceflight really coming together and showing their strength. So this is the rollout of the Space Shuttle Orbiter Enterprise. This is in September of 1976. This is a part of the bicentennial year, and NASA had great plans for this. This vehicle was going to be named Constitution, and it was going to be rolled out on Constitution Day. So this is Constitution Day of 1976, except the crowd in front of it is largely the original series cast of Star Trek, but invited as the special guests because Star Trek fans had done a write-in campaign and had sent letters to NASA, to the White House, and convinced President Gerald Ford that the first vehicle in the Space Shuttle fleet should not be named Constitution. It should be named Enterprise. And so we have this wonderful connection between the way spaceflight has been imagined and the way that it gets executed, and this excitement that this vehicle that is going to carry men and women of different races doing lots of interesting scientific work and exploration into low Earth orbit should carry the name that carried this pioneering cast on television in the 1960s. So, jumping ahead and taking a look at another set of objects that you may have had in your own toy chest, we come to Star Wars action figures. So by the late 1970s, around the same time that you're rolling out the Enterprise and there's more and more attention to the coming space shuttle program and a lot of genuine excitement about that, space science fiction is considered a dead genre. Nobody's interested in it anymore until Star Wars. Star Wars in 1977 is an absolute game changer in a number of ways, some of which are really about the material culture, about the objects, about the toys. So usually, you didn't do merchandise for a movie. They came and went too fast. It wasn't a good business bet. You might merchandise a radio program that has longer life, a television program that has longer life, but movies are too ephemeral. They come, they go. George Lucas knew what he had. He was very excited about having toys for Star Wars. Most of the major toy companies passed on being able to merchandise this. And so it is that Kenner, which is a division of General Mills, the cereal maker that was based in Cincinnati, gets the contract to create the toys. And one of the things that they create are these small handheld toys. So instead of large action figures in the 11 or 12 inch size, your G.I. Joe, your Barbie size toys, they go with action figures that you can hold in your hand. Now, let's go back to our script of things with Robin Bernstein and what the toys tell you about how you're going to play with them. This isn't a toy that you're seeing yourself embodying. You're controlling droids, you're controlling women, you're controlling men, you're controlling aliens, you're controlling humans, and you're playing out these kinds of stories with them. It was a great toy because boys and girls played together. I will tell you that my brother and I and the girl next door, kind of, if between us we had all the figures we wanted, we considered that we owned all the things we needed to play out what we wanted to play out. So Emily, that we always enjoyed playing with you with these things, and so boys and girls would play with this together. And there was also this sense with these kinds of toys that you were being pushed towards completeness in a way that you not necessarily had before. So if any of you had this kind of an action figure carrying case, it has little slots in the carrying case.
I did.
There's short ones for your R2-D2. There's short ones for your Yoda figure. There's tall ones for your Chewbacca. There's tall ones for your Darth Vader, and medium-sized ones for some of the other figures. And they came with little labels. And you could put the labels in and keep track. And of course, if you had the case and you had the labels, then you probably wanted to make sure that you had the toy that went in it. And so this is one of the places where the marketing of these toys really sets a whole new standard for how this kind of play gets done, both in terms of who's playing and the point of view that they're bringing to the play, but also in this sense of wanting to have all of the figures. So many who collect Star Wars toys can tell you that the card backs on the back of the individual blister packs that carry an individual action figure had pictures of all of the toys that had been produced up to that point. And in fact, sometimes little tick boxes where you could check off which of them you had. Those card backs have themselves become collectible. So Star Wars really revolutionizes and reinvigorates space science fiction in the late 1970s and fundamentally changes the face of how these kinds of bits of material culture are created and sold and consumed.
I had the Darth Vader with the lightsaber that came out of his arm.
Yes.
You would like push it up and it would like, you could make the noise, right?
Yeah.
But you had to push it out of his arm and it would suck back into his arm. Like,
and it was very
that.
easily bent, right? You had to make sure that your kid brother or the dog didn't get a hold of it.
Yeah.
So we could go to our next one, and I could stay on Star Wars for a very long time, on Star Trek for a very long time. I'll skip us almost to the end of the book. One of the great things that Smithsonian Books did with Space Craze is encourage me to really bring it up to the present. And so this is a new piece that came into the collection very recently. It is Master Chief's helmet from Halo, the Microsoft Xbox video game, space-based, that then has become a whole multimedia franchise, so storytelling across different kinds of media. And one of the unique things, again, coming back to the point of view, if you think about Master Chief as a character, if you've ever played Halo and you have embodied the Master Chief character as you're running around the world, you are seeing out through this mirror visor. And so you embody whoever you are, you can be that main character. You are, by definition, that main character. And it's only until very recently in the one-season television show that we ever got a look at Master Chief. We have some sense of the perhaps blonde, muscular male hero-ness, but by definition, as a video game, you were playing through that. And because the visor was mirrored in that way, we always had that sense that it was the world reflected back to our eyes, not necessarily to a particularly gendered character. And so this is a helmet that was created so that a person could wear it to kind of go to charity events or things like that, embodying the character. Being able to do this, to have shows like, or video games like Halo, to have things like The Expanse, the new Star Trek, the new Star Wars, all of that new imagining about spaceflight that has really boomed so much in the last few years, was a great piece to be able to reinforce this question of how Americans have been excited about spaceflight and how we have seen ourselves embodied in these stories. But it's not only in the imagining, I'll go to my next slide, it's in the executing as well. And the connections there that you see between the way that spaceflight has been imagined and the way that it has been executed. So I'm able to include all of the very historic launches of 2021 from SpaceX, from Blue Origin, from Virgin Galactic in the body of the book, but also to point out the ways that on the left here from SpaceX, the Falcon 9 takes its name from the Millennium Falcon. And on the right here from Blue Origin, there are two vehicles. The one, the suborbital vehicle, is named the New Shepard, after Alan Shepard, who we saw in the Mercury 7 picture, the first American to do a suborbital flight, and that is the Blue Origin suborbital vehicle. And the name of their orbital vehicle is the New Glenn, after John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth. And so the power, I think, in the ways that that imagination and that historic personage of who those are really then feeds into and continues to shape how people are excited about what's going into space right now. So I'll end with my last slide and just give you my thanks for the chance to share this work with you. You can find me on Twitter, now X, at Instagram, at the National Air and Space Museum's website, and it is just such a pleasure to get to talk to you about the ways that spaceflight has been imagined and the way that spaceflight has been executed, and how those things really can be embodied in these physical toys, these physical pieces of memorabilia that we have at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. So thank you.
All right. Let's see here, folks. I was going through the entire time. I'm juggling a lot of stuff here, but I think I'm in the camera. Yeah, I'm in the camera. That was so interesting, like looking through some of the stuff, because hearing you talk about it made me think about some things that I've never thought about before, like the fact that, Master Chief's helmet is reflective. You don't get to see inside. You don't see who this person is, so you don't maybe make some assumptions. Oh, they're really tall, they're really strong, right? But there's some interpretation you can have there, and you can sort of put yourself in the role better. There's other things like that, like Metroid. Samus from Metroid. Whenever you first start playing the game, you're like, oh, there's a person. It's a space person fighting through space, right?
Yes.
And at the end, when you win, hey, did you see that coming? There's all sorts of interesting things like that.
One of the really interesting pieces that we brought into the collection almost at the same time is we have a helmet screen used from the Bobby Draper character from The Expanse.
Right.
So a Martian Marine played by a Samoan actress who brings a lot of strength and piloting acumen, and so is not the character who gets captured necessarily and needs rescuing, she is the rescuer, and a really powerful character. And in a cast where you then are the creators of The Expanse talked very explicitly when they started that they were really thinking they did not want to do white guys in space.
Right, white guys in space. Nice.
So that's when you really then have a deeply diverse cast, you can start to break out of, but it's also done really in playing against what they know what the expectations for the genre are.
Yep.
And that they are then going to blow those apart and do something really new and creative with it.
Yeah. It's like when you were talking about the shuttle class, right?
Yeah.
And you saw the diversity, all the different people in shuttle. You mentioned that's where they went, not from test pilots, right? The gritty folks who strapped themselves to the top of a bomb and, et cetera, but more the scientists. The doctors, that sort of stuff. And the skill set really opens up. It's not just who's courageous enough to do this. It's you have to be courageous enough to get on the shuttle, but you also have other skills that are going to be required to take that next step into space, right? And that really is where we are now. It's like, how many different people will it take? We've gone so far past, only test pilots can fly these things, right? We start to see things like Virgin Galactic, where they had normal people that were aboard the flight, 2 flights ago, I guess, when we were out there. And you could just see these normal people, not crazy special skills or anything like that, but just people starting to go to space.
For a long time, people have said, what would happen, what we should send is an artist, right? Someone who could really expressively bring that back. And I was really struck when William Shatner went up that he came back with a very different reaction. It really shook him. He had a deeply, profoundly emotional reaction to being in space, but one that he found very discomforting. And I thought, I wonder if this is one of the first moments where we've really, truly sent an artist and not necessarily a trained engineer to experience what this means. And you start to get not only the overview effect in this sense of kind of our unity as a world, looking at a world without borders, but some also profoundly different emotional, visceral reactions to this experience. And I'll be interested to see, as you continue to have more and different kinds of people getting to go into space, how that gives us other flavors of what it might mean to have that experience.
Yep, absolutely. It's so interesting because think of William Shatner and how many times he played being in space, and the Enterprise is getting attacked, right? We had to shake the camera some for y'all. And he pretended, I can say pretended, he pretended to be in space for so long as part of the show, and then to actually be in space and see what it was actually like. I wonder if that influenced his experience in any way, I
don't know. I have to wonder about that. And I do think, that's such a seminal character, in some ways a little bit in this Buck Rogers type, right? Of being the ladies' man, the hero, the, muscular, at the point of a phaser, but who also then is, a part of really the many ways that spaceflight has been imagined.
Yeah. Your slide about the westward expansion, right?
Yes.
Showing that land will set us free, it will make us free. Well, it's not really the land. We think about that when we're gravitationally bound, right? But it's more about space to spread out, resources to use, this sort of thing. And when you start to get away from gravity and you get into outer space, I was like, you know something? It's not just the land, it's the space, the resources to spread out.
And it gets called the final frontier.
The final frontier.
Right? And there's a lot of frontier, especially John Kennedy called his young cadre of policy men who had come to Washington with him were his new frontiersmen. And so we see that really coming up a lot. And it's one of the things that I often get asked is, are there, okay, you've made a case for the Western and the American context. What about Russian? What about European? What about, and what we find is other scholars have looked at that, and the Russian context to the Soviet context was often culturally Russian. Right. And rooted in cosmism, this kind of belief, philosophical, that they would all end up in the stars in some days. Yeah. And so you see that. You see folks who have looked as scholars at the European context for understanding spaceflight, and it comes at a slightly different cultural basis. So it helps to support some of the analysis that I've done about what's particularly American about these things, and starting also then with things, which... I admit, drives the analysis in some ways much more towards television, much more towards memorabilia of actual spaceflight or of films versus literary science fiction. There just aren't enough Isaac Asimov action figures. Yeah,
there's not enough Isaac Asimov. Nice.
So I don't get the material things that get me to drive the analysis. And so that is a part of what I was putting together, which is not trying to be comprehensive, but to give you a little bit of this deep dive and hopefully make you think a little differently about some of the things you might have on your desk or that you might have in your toy chest.
In my parents' attic, maybe, if the Ewok village is still up there. Like, I had the whole Ewok village with the net and everything. Right? The Millennium Falcon, where you could open the top up, and I had the X-Wing, but you could put the battle damage on it, right? Really? But then once you put that on, you couldn't take it back off. Yeah. And I was like, I want my clean new X-Wing again. And if you try, it peeled the sticker underneath it. Like, I remember this from my childhood, just pretending. But what you were saying about how, the blasters and stuff like that, it's like, I'm Buck Rogers. I'm out there, pew, 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 right? I had to say, chat mostly just said pew, pew, pew a lot.
Yes.
When I was going. But, I'm this character versus I'm playing with these characters or I'm making the show of these characters. I never really thought about it that way before. I melted a fair bit of lead in my time, too, but no, not a reflection on my parents, but that was just a thing, I guess. Not in the 50s, but in the 80s, maybe. So, anyways, thank you so much for taking the time this evening.
This was wonderful.
It wasn't, it's not just this presentation. Like, if you thought this was interesting, you have an entire book on this, don't you?
Yes.
Let's show it again here real quick. Like, I lean over and press the button. That's you on Twitter/X. I like the line in there, which one it is. And then Instagram as well. In chat, if the mods could put the link in chat, we do have a link if you want to check out this book. It's a link over to Amazon. And if you want to check out Space Craze as a viewer, click on that link. And I think it's available like paperback, a couple different formats, right?
Yep.
Gotcha. And so this is going to have more analysis, like more of your discussion of this. It's got lots of pictures in it.
It's got lots of pictures of things from the museum and really kind of walks you through comprehensively from 1929 through to as close to the present as I could get right before the book had to go in.
Gotcha. So if you want more information, if you found this was interesting, maybe share this around so other people can see it as well. But you can pick up the book, or some of these artifacts are in a museum.
They are, in fact, at the National Air and Space Museum, and we are doing construction, so you need a free time ticket if you want to visit us at the museum in Washington, D.C., but we hope that you'll come, and you can always just go to the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia by Dulles Airport.
There's a lot of cool stuff in there.
There was a lot of cool stuff.
I like the fact it's like we have so many artifacts, we need a hanger to put these in.
Yes.
So we're going to get a hanger that's over here and then just fill it with cool stuff, aeronautics, space. There's so much stuff in there.
It's wonderful.
She's like, this guy just said there's so much stuff in the hangar. Like, seriously? We're a little bit over the end of the show here. Y'all, we're sort of running it here. You see me leaning over one way to change slides and stuff. Margaret, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening.
Thank you, John. This was great.
Excellent. And y'all, thank you for understanding as well. Intrepid Museum, the astronomy night unfortunately had to be canceled, but we were both here. We had the presentation, we had the technology, even though people couldn't make it to the museum in person this evening because of the weather. Everybody stay safe out there. Don't travel around unnecessarily here in New York City. We could still do the show and bring it to you virtually so that you could share in the space craze. For now, that's going to bring us to the end of our show here this evening. I know there's probably a ton of questions in the chat, but we need to pack up. You need to get back on the road to get on down back to D.C., right?
Yes.
And that will be the end of our show today. Again, if you're watching this, make sure you follow on whatever channel you're watching on. If you're on the museum's channel, subscribe over there, click the thumbs up, like and subscribe, or whatever it is, right? You know how to get back to these shows. We try to do these about once a month. They're often different formats. Sometimes we're on Zoom calls. Sometimes we're at the museum. This is the first time we've done it this way, but hey, we still got it done. But you know how to get back to the channel if you would like to see this sort of content in the future. Also, if you're on the NSF channels, there's a launch coming up tonight, as long as it hasn't been scrubbed. I'm not going to try to look at my phone, but there was supposed to be a Starlink launch coming up, and I assume, last I checked when I started the show, that was still on. The mods will correct me in chat if that's not true anymore. But for now, we're going to go ahead and shut down this slide. I'll leave your show. I will leave you with the slide. Again, follow Margaret here over on Twitter or Instagram. Lots of interesting stuff. I went through. You speak at a lot of Comic Cons and stuff like that.
I do.
Right?
That's where the people are.
Where they are. It is. That's where the people are. Well, today, hopefully, y'all were at home watching, and we were able to bring it to you here virtually. But that is the end of today's virtual astronomy night. Again, massive thanks to the folks here at Inc. 48 in New York City. I don't know if it's the closest hotel to the museum, but this is a really nice place to stay. If you want to pop across the street, I just walked over from the museum to here. So massive thanks for them accommodating here when we couldn't get into the museum and setting us up with a conference room. Again, it's Inc. 48 over here on the west side in New York City. For now, that's going to be the end of our show. I'm John Galloway, Dr. Margaret Weitekamp. Thank you again so much, and we will see you nerds later. I've got to lean over and press the button to... Hang on.
And here we go. We have liftoff. Propulsion continues to be nominal.
R68 chamber pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, planet.
Water towers, fly! Yes! Tango down to nominal.
Flight downside FD off. Bring in FD off. It's orange!
25! Oh my god! Oh my god!
Decollage. What is it? Put that in the big bag,
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed.
We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
This methane would be igniting in the flare, correct?